It was 9 o'clock in the morning on January 9, 1923. At Holloway Prison in North London, a 29-year-old woman named Edith Thompson was being prepared for execution. She had spent the night in a state of near collapse. She had barely eaten in the final days of her imprisonment. She had been sedated heavily in the early hours of the morning because without sedation she could not be managed. She lay on the floor of the condemned cell and cried and moaned. When the executioner, John Ellis, entered to pinion her arms before the walk to the gallows, she could not stand. She had to be lifted. She fainted completely. She was carried from the condemned cell to the execution shed by 2 prison warders and 2 assistants. She could not stand on the trap. The warders held her upright. John Ellis wrote afterwards that when he first saw her that morning, she looked dead already. She was hanged while unconscious, supported by 4 people, for a murder that her co-accused, the man who actually committed the killing, had consistently, at every stage, in every statement, on his own walk to the gallows at Pentonville Prison that same morning, denied she had any part in. Frederick Bywaters went to the gallows like a gentleman. Composed. Calm. Still insisting that Edith was innocent. He was 20 years old. Edith Thompson was 29 years old, born on Christmas Day, the chief buyer at a millinery firm in the City of London, a senior professional role that very few women of her background and era held. She was, by every account of people who knew her, vivid and intelligent and full of life. She was hanged at 9 in the morning. Bywaters was hanged at exactly the same moment, at Pentonville, 1 mile away. The 2 prisons were close enough that, if the wind had been right, the bells of one might have been heard from the other. Her own lawyer said it afterwards, plainly and without qualification, Mrs. Thompson was hanged for immorality. Not for murder. For immorality. 3 questions will follow us through this story today. Was Edith Thompson guilty of the murder of her husband, when the man who killed him denied, at every opportunity, that she had known what was coming or played any part in planning it? How did 62 love letters become a murder conviction, and what do those letters, read carefully and in full context, actually say about what Edith Thompson wanted and what she did? And what does it tell us about England in 1923, about the law, about the treatment of women, about the particular fury that a married woman's sexuality provoked in the Edwardian moral imagination, that a woman was sedated, carried unconscious to a gallows, and hanged, while the man who did the killing died declaring her innocent? Before we go further, if this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, the subscribe button is just below this video. We cover true crime from around the world, told with the detail and care it deserves. No sensationalism. No rushing through the facts. Just the full story, properly told. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. To understand what happened to Edith Thompson, we have to understand who she was, the world she lived in, and the marriage she was trying to escape from. Because the story of this case does not begin on the night of October 3, 1922, when Percy Thompson was stabbed in a street in Ilford. It begins years before that, in the particular domestic world that produced the letters. And the letters are the case. Ilford in 1916 was a suburb of East London, respectable, orderly, the kind of place where a shipping clerk and his wife could rent a comfortable villa and maintain a life that looked, from the outside, exactly as it was supposed to look. The First World War was in its 2nd year. The men who had not yet gone to France were working. The women who had not yet gone to the factories were keeping the households running, maintaining the surface of normality over the enormous, grinding anxiety of the era. Britain in 1916 was a country that had already lost hundreds of thousands of men and was bracing for the loss of hundreds of thousands more. Edith Graydon married Percy Thompson in January 1916. She was 22 years old. He was 25. They had grown up near each other in Manor Park, East London. The marriage was, by all the evidence, a conventional one, which is to say, one that suited Percy considerably more than it suited Edith. Percy Thompson was a shipping clerk. He was described by contemporaries as solid, respectable, decent, and dull. He had a jealous streak. He was, according to later accounts, including Edith's own, sometimes physically violent with her, throwing her across a room, striking her. He was also, apparently, largely indifferent to her inner life, her intelligence, her ambitions. Edith Thompson was none of the things that Ilford in 1916 asked a woman to be. She was the chief buyer at Carlton and Pryor, a millinery firm in the City of London, a position of real professional authority that she had earned through competence and intelligence in a world that did not automatically give either to women. She read voraciously. She went to the theatre. She had strong aesthetic opinions and expressed them. She wrote letters of real literary quality, vivid, dramatic, emotionally precise, and she wrote them constantly, because writing was, for Edith, a way of thinking and feeling that the domestic life of an Ilford villa did not provide. The marriage that was supposed to complete her life had instead confined it. In the summer of 1921, Frederick Bywaters came to stay with the Thompsons at their villa in Kensington Gardens, Ilford. Frederick Bywaters was 18 years old. He was a merchant seaman, employed by the P&O shipping line, assigned to routes in the Pacific and Indian Oceans that took him away from England for months at a time. He was handsome, physically confident, and 8 years younger than Edith. He had known the Thompson family for years, he had grown up near them, had been part of the same East London social world. He and Edith had kissed once before on a charabanc outing to the Isle of Wight. There had been something between them, briefly, and then he had gone to sea and she had married Percy and the something had been set aside. When he came to stay at the villa in the summer of 1921, the something came back. The affair began while Bywaters was living in the house. Percy discovered it. There was a confrontation. Bywaters demanded that Percy give Edith a divorce. Percy refused and ordered Bywaters out of the house. Bywaters left. Edith later told police, and it appears in the documentary record, that after Bywaters left, Percy struck her repeatedly and threw her across the room. From September 1921, Bywaters was at sea again. He would not return to London for months. Edith wrote to him. She wrote to him constantly. Over the following year, Edith Thompson wrote 62 letters to Frederick Bywaters. He was on board his ship. She was in the Ilford villa with Percy. The letters were addressed to him at ports along his route, Aden, Bombay, Port Said, and collected when the ship docked. The letters were, in the truest sense, her inner life externalized. They were passionate, literary, sometimes theatrical, sometimes hysterical in the Edwardian sense of the word, that is emotionally intense rather than medically disordered. They described her daily existence. They described her feelings for Bywaters with a directness and an explicitness that was, for the era, extraordinary. They described her misery in the marriage. They described her fantasies of escape. Some of the letters described something more disturbing. Something that would, when they were read aloud in court, seal Edith Thompson's fate. In several of the letters, Edith described attempts to harm her husband. She wrote that she had ground glass and put it in his food. She wrote that she had given him something. The letters are oblique about what, that was supposed to make him ill. She wrote, in one passage that the prosecution quoted repeatedly, "You said it was enough for an elephant." Perhaps it was. She asked Bywaters, in at least one letter, to send her something to give her husband. These passages were the prosecution's case. Alongside the undeniable fact of the affair, they painted a picture of a woman who had not only desired her husband's death but had been actively trying to bring it about, and who had finally conspired with her lover to have it done. The prosecution argued that the letters constituted evidence of a conspiracy, that Edith Thompson had communicated her intention to kill her husband to Bywaters, and that Bywaters had acted on that intention. Bywaters, when arrested, said no. He said he had acted alone. He said he had attacked Percy on impulse, in the street, without Edith's knowledge or plan. He said she had nothing to do with it. He said this from the moment of his arrest to the moment of his execution. He never changed his account. Percy Thompson was 32 years old when he was stabbed to death on the night of October 3, 1922. He had married Edith 6 years before. He had, by all accounts, a genuine attachment to her, whether he understood her or not. He was not a monster. He was a man of his time and his class, which meant he was the kind of man who hit his wife and saw no particular contradiction between that and considering himself a good husband. He did not know that his wife was in love with someone else. Or perhaps he did know. There had been the confrontation in the summer of 1921, the demand for the divorce, the order that Bywaters leave. He knew about the affair. What he apparently did not know, or did not fully absorb, was that Edith's feelings for Bywaters were not simply an episode but a sustained, deepening commitment that had been maintained across a year of correspondence. He went to the theatre on the evening of October 3 with Edith. They saw a performance at the Criterion Theatre in Piccadilly Circus in the West End. They came home by train to Ilford. They were walking from the station toward their house when a figure jumped from behind some bushes. Percy was stabbed. He died before help arrived. Edith, when the police came, identified the attacker as Frederick Bywaters. She explained his connection to herself and her husband. She did not, apparently, attempt to protect him. The police investigated. They found the letters. And everything changed. The attack happened on Belgrave Road in Ilford, at about midnight. The Thompsons had been among the last people off the train. The street was quiet. The area was residential. Frederick Bywaters had been back in London for about 10 days, on shore leave before his next voyage. He and Edith had met during those days, they had exchanged notes and telegrams, had arranged to see each other. The accounts of what was planned for the night of October 3 are not entirely consistent between the various statements made afterwards. Bywaters said, consistently, that he had gone to the street that night on impulse. That he had not planned to attack Percy. That something, the sight of them together, some accumulation of feeling, had made him do it without premeditation. He jumped from behind the bushes. Percy turned. There was a struggle. Bywaters stabbed him several times. Percy stumbled. Bywaters ran. Neighbors reported hearing a woman screaming, "No, don't," repeatedly at the time of the attack. This detail is significant. "No, don't," spoken by Edith in the street, apparently in response to the attack, could mean almost anything. It could mean she was horrified and trying to stop it. It could, the prosecution would later suggest, mean she was performing horror she did not feel. The two interpretations are equally available from two words in the dark, and the trial would turn to a remarkable degree on which of them you were predisposed to believe. Percy died in the street. Edith knelt beside him, screaming. A local doctor was summoned. He could not save him. Edith gave the police everything they needed to find Bywaters. She identified him. She told them where he lived. She described the affair. She appeared, at this stage of the proceedings, to believe entirely that she was a witness to the murder of her husband, not an accused party to it. This assessment turned out to be optimistic. The police searched Bywaters's belongings and found Edith's letters. All 62 of them. Bywaters had kept everyone. They were tied in bundles, organized by date. He had kept the evidence of their relationship the way someone keeps something precious, not carelessly, not accidentally, but as a record of something he valued. The letters were read by detectives. The passages about the ground glass and the something for Percy were flagged immediately. Edith Thompson was arrested. She maintained, consistently, that she had not planned the attack. That she had not known it was coming. That the passages in the letters about harming Percy were fantasies, literary constructions, emotional performances for her lover, not accounts of real actions. She maintained that she had never actually put anything in Percy's food or drink. The post-mortem on Percy Thompson supported her claim. No traces of ground glass were found in his digestive system. No unusual substances were detected. Percy Thompson had died from stab wounds, not from poisoning. There was no physical evidence that any of the described poisoning attempts had actually taken place. The letters described things that did not happen. They described them in the present tense, with dramatic intensity, in the way someone who reads novels and goes to the theater and writes with feeling might describe things she imagined, or wanted, or was performing for an audience of one. This was the defense's position. It was a coherent position. It was supported by the forensic evidence. It was not supported by the letters themselves, which read, on the page, in the cold light of a courtroom, not as literary fantasy but as factual account. Edith gave the police everything they needed to find Bywaters. She identified him. She told them where he lived. She described the affair. She appeared, at this stage of the proceedings, to believe entirely that she was a witness to the murder of her husband, not an accused party to it. This assessment turned out to be optimistic. The police searched Bywaters's belongings and found Edith's letters. All 62 of them. Bywaters had kept everyone. They were tied in bundles, organized by date. He had kept the evidence of their relationship the way someone keeps something precious, not carelessly, not accidentally, but as a record of something he valued. The letters were read by detectives. The passages about the ground glass and the something for Percy were flagged immediately. Edith Thompson was arrested. She maintained, consistently, that she had not planned the attack. That she had not known it was coming. That the passages in the letters about harming Percy were fantasies, literary constructions, emotional performances for her lover, not accounts of real actions. She maintained that she had never actually put anything in Percy's food or drink. The post-mortem on Percy Thompson supported her claim. No traces of ground glass were found in his digestive system. No unusual substances were detected. Percy Thompson had died from stab wounds, not from poisoning. There was no physical evidence that any of the described poisoning attempts had actually taken place. The letters described things that did not happen. They described them in the present tense, with dramatic intensity, in the way someone who reads novels and goes to the theater and writes with feeling might describe things she imagined, or wanted, or was performing for an audience of one. This was the defense's position. It was a coherent position. It was supported by the forensic evidence. It was not supported by the letters themselves, which read, on the page, in the cold light of a courtroom, not as literary fantasy but as factual account. The prosecution, led by the Solicitor General Sir Thomas Inskip, read selected passages from the letters aloud in court. The defense was not always able to present the context, the literary precedents Edith was drawing on, the dramatic register she was writing in, the fact that she was a woman who consumed novels and whose letters reflected the emotional vocabulary of the fiction she read. What the jury heard was this. A woman who had told her lover she was grinding glass into her husband's food. A woman who had written about dosing him. A woman who had asked for something to give him. A woman who had described his potential death with something that read, in the prosecution's rendering, like anticipation. They also heard, and this was not directly relevant to the charge but was everywhere in the atmosphere of the trial, that this woman had been conducting a passionate affair with a man 8 years her junior. That she had been writing him letters of explicit emotional and physical intimacy. That she was an adulteress. The word adulteress does not appear in the charge sheet. It is not a criminal offense in English law. But it saturated the trial in the way that a fact not formally in evidence can saturate a room, present in every question, every glance, every moment when the judge described the letters as the outpourings of a silly but at the same time a wicked affection. Silly. Wicked. The words of a man passing moral judgment, not legal judgment. The words of Mr. Justice Shearman, who was, as one contemporary observer put it, obviously a very Victorian gentleman with high moral principles. The most important fact in the case of Edith Thompson is one that the court heard clearly and declined to give adequate weight. Frederick Bywaters, the man who stabbed Percy Thompson, said plainly and repeatedly that Edith Thompson had not known he was going to attack her husband that night. He said she had not planned it with him. He said she had not asked him to do it. He said he had acted alone, on impulse, without her knowledge. He said this at every stage. He said it to the police. He said it at the committal hearing. He said it at the trial. He said it at the appeal. He went to the gallows saying it. A man facing his own execution had no material incentive to protect someone else. If anything, Bywaters might have benefited, in terms of sympathy, in terms of a possible reprieve, from presenting himself as the tool of an older, manipulative woman rather than as the sole agent of a spontaneous violent act. He did not do that. He took sole responsibility. He maintained it absolutely. The court acknowledged this. The court convicted Edith Thompson anyway. The trial of Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters opened at the Old Bailey on December 6, 1922. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Shearman. The prosecution was led by the Solicitor General, Sir Thomas Inskip, assisted by Travers Humphreys, both men of considerable legal reputation. The defense of Edith Thompson was conducted by Sir Henry Curtis Bennet KC, one of the most respected barristers in England. Curtis Bennet decided that he later described as the worst mistake of his professional life. He advised Edith not to go into the witness box. He believed that her letters were already damaging enough, and that cross-examination would make things worse. He believed the jury could be persuaded to acquit on the basis that the physical evidence did not support the conspiracy theory, that Percy's body contained no glass, no poison, no evidence of any of the attempts described in the letters. Edith overruled him. She went into the witness box. Curtis Bennet was right about what happened next. Under cross-examination by Inskip, Edith was asked what she had meant when she wrote asking Bywaters to send her something to give her husband. She said she had no idea. The answer was, as one contemporary writer noted, hardly convincing. A woman who wrote with the precision and vividness that the letters demonstrated, asked about a specific passage in her own correspondence, saying she had no idea what she meant. The jury, watching her, did not believe it. Curtis Bennet told colleagues afterwards that the moment she said she had no idea, he knew the verdict. The first major reversal in this case is the decision to try Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters together. The logic of a joint trial in a conspiracy case is sound. If two people are accused of acting in concert, trying them separately allows each to give evidence that might advantage themselves at the expense of the other, and prevents the full picture from emerging. But in this case, the joint trial produced a specific and devastating effect. The evidence of Bywaters's guilt, his presence at the scene, the murder weapon, his confession, was overwhelming. The jury convicted Bywaters, and because Edith was in the dock beside him, because the letters were in evidence, because the affair was established and the moral atmosphere of the trial was poisoned by it, they convicted her too. Her defense counsel argued at the committal stage that the letters did not connect her to the place or manner of the murder. The magistrate overruled him. The Old Bailey revisited the question. The judge overruled it again. The letters were the case. And the letters, read selectively and without literary context, in a courtroom, by a prosecution that was not primarily interested in what they meant and primarily interested in what they appeared to mean, the letters convicted her. The first major reversal in this case is the decision to try Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters together. The logic of a joint trial in a conspiracy case is sound. If two people are accused of acting in concert, trying them separately allows each to give evidence that might advantage themselves at the expense of the other, and prevents the full picture from emerging. But in this case, The joint trial produced a specific and devastating effect. The evidence of Bywaters's guilt, his presence at the scene, the murder weapon, his confession, was overwhelming. The jury convicted Bywaters, and because Edith was in the dock beside him, because the letters were in evidence, because the affair was established and the moral atmosphere of the trial was poisoned by it, they convicted her too. Her defense counsel argued at the committal stage that the letters did not connect her to the place or manner of the murder. The magistrate overruled him. The Old Bailey revisited the question. The judge overruled it again. The letters were the case. And the letters, read selectively and without literary context, in a courtroom, by a prosecution that was not primarily interested in what they meant and primarily interested in what they appeared to mean, the letters convicted her. The second major reversal is what the trial was actually about. At its core, the prosecution's case was this: a woman who committed adultery with a younger man, who wrote him letters expressing the desire that her husband would die, who asked him to send her substances with which to harm the husband. Such a woman, morally, is capable of conspiracy to murder. The logic is not legal logic. It is moral logic. And it is precisely the kind of reasoning that English law, at its best, is supposed to prevent from entering a criminal trial. English criminal law requires proof of specific acts, not proof of moral character. The prosecution did not prove that Edith Thompson had committed any specific act that contributed to Percy Thompson's death. It proved, persuasively and in detail, that she was an adulteress who had written letters expressing violent fantasies about her husband. And it invited the jury to infer, from that, a conspiracy. The jury made the inference. The judge, in his summing up, helped them make it. Mr. Justice Shearman described the letters as evidence of a wicked affection and spent considerable time on the adultery in a summing up that was, in the assessment of legal historians since, fair in law but profoundly unfair in emphasis. What he emphasized was the immorality. What he gave insufficient weight to was the absence of physical evidence and the fact that the man who did the killing had denied, absolutely, that she planned it. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. You have heard the case. You know that Percy Thompson's body contained no physical evidence of any of the poisoning attempts described in the letters. You know that Frederick Bywaters said, at every stage including on the gallows, that Edith did not know he was going to attack Percy that night. You know that the letters were written in a dramatic, literary register by a woman who read novels and went to the theater. You also know that the letters asked for something to give her husband. That some passages read, in a courtroom, like factual accounts of attempted murder. If you had been on that jury, in December 1922, having read those letters, how do you vote? Drop your answer in the comments. Because the answer tells you something important not just about 1922 but about the gap between a legal verdict and a just one. The third major reversal is what happened after the verdict. A petition against the executions was signed by nearly 1 million people. 1 million. In a country of 42 million, nearly 1 in 42 signed. The petition was placed in cinemas, tube stations, and theaters, and people signed it in enormous numbers, not because they were certain of Edith's innocence, but because they were not certain of her guilt, and because the idea of hanging a 29-year-old woman on the basis of love letters felt, to 1 million people, like something England should not do. Bywaters wrote letter after letter to the Home Secretary, to the King, to anyone who might hear him, insisting that Edith was innocent and asking that his own life be taken and hers spared. The Home Secretary refused. The King declined to intervene. The Cabinet discussed the case. The executions went ahead. At the moment of the hangings, 9 o'clock in the morning, January 9, 1923, protesters gathered outside both prisons. Both were hanging simultaneously. Edith Thompson was carried to the gallows unconscious. Bywaters walked to his death still maintaining her innocence. The man who hanged Edith Thompson was John Ellis. He was 50 years old. He had been England's principal executioner for nearly 20 years. He had hanged Dr. Crippen in 1910. He had hanged Roger Casement in 1916. He was considered the most experienced and capable executioner in the country. He wrote in his memoir that when he entered Edith Thompson's cell on the morning of January 9, 1923, she looked dead already. She had to be carried. She was supported on the trap by 4 people. Ellis pinioned her arms while she was semi-conscious. He placed the noose. He operated the trap. He resigned from his post in March 1924. He took to drinking heavily. In 1924 he attempted suicide by shooting himself in the jaw, and survived. Suicide was a criminal offence in England in 1924. John Ellis was charged and bound over at Rochdale Magistrates' Court. 8 years later, in September 1932, after another bout of heavy drinking, John Ellis died by suicide. He cut his throat with a razor. His colleagues disputed whether the Thompson execution was the cause of his deterioration. He performed 11 more executions after resigning as principal executioner before he died. The connection between Edith Thompson's execution and his death cannot be established definitively. What can be established is that the man who hanged her spent 9 years deteriorating after doing it and died by his own hand. The newspapers in 1922 had names for Edith Thompson. The Messalina of Ilford, a reference to the notoriously licentious wife of the Roman Emperor Claudius. A Jezebel. A temptress. A woman who had used her sexuality to lead a young man to his destruction. These names were applied by journalists who had read the letters in court and made a calculation about what kind of woman wrote letters like that. The calculation was not primarily about guilt or innocence. It was about a kind of woman who had no business existing in Ilford in 1922, vivid, passionate, intellectually ambitious, sexually honest, openly dissatisfied with her domestic life. Rebecca West, the celebrated journalist and novelist, who was herself conducting an affair at the time with H.G. Wells, a considerably older married man, publicly called Edith Thompson a shocking piece of rubbish. West's characterization of Thompson was an act of social distancing. West was the intellectual adulteress, the kind whose affair produced a famous son and a literary career. Edith was the common adulteress, the kind whose affair produced a murder charge. The distinction is one of class and register. Edith Thompson did not perform her transgression in a way that the intellectual culture of the era could absorb and aestheticize. She did it in Ilford. She wrote about it in letters to a merchant seaman. She was working class in the sense that mattered. She had not transformed her desires into cultural capital. She was simply a woman who wanted more than her life offered her. Who wrote about wanting more with a passion and a directness that the era could not forgive. Who found, in Frederick Bywaters, someone who saw what she was and matched it. And who, when Percy Thompson was dead, could not escape the implications of every word she had written. I want to return to the letters one more time, because I think they have been misread for a century. The ground glass. The poisoning attempts. The something to give her husband. Here is what the physical evidence established. Percy Thompson's body contained no glass and no poison. None of the described attempts had left any trace in his body. Either they happened and failed completely, which is forensically implausible for repeated glass ingestion over time, or they did not happen. The letters, read in the context of what Edith Thompson was actually like, a woman who devoured romantic and sensational fiction, who described her own feelings in theatrical terms, who was writing to a lover she saw rarely and needed to maintain at a fever pitch of emotional intensity. The letters read differently. They read like a woman who was performing a version of herself for someone she loved. Who was writing, as people in intense romantic correspondence often write, the most dramatic and passionate version of events. Who was saying, I am trying to free us. I am doing something. I am not just waiting. Look at what I am willing to do. Whether any of it was real, whether she actually ground glass, whether she actually put anything in his food, the physical evidence said no. The body said no. What the prosecution had was the letters, and what the jury had was the letters, and in the reading of those letters, the life of Edith Thompson was decided. Her lawyer said it. Mrs. Thompson was hanged for immorality. Not for murder. Not for conspiracy. For writing letters that revealed a passionate, transgressive inner life that England in 1923 did not know what to do with except extinguish. Frederick Bywaters was 20 years old when he was hanged. He had stabbed Percy Thompson in a street in Ilford and had never denied it. He was guilty of murder by the straightforward measure of the law. He knew that. He accepted it. What he would not accept, what he fought against with every statement and every letter in the weeks between conviction and execution, was that Edith should die for something she had not done. He tried, as best a 20-year-old on death row can try, to trade himself for her. To be the price paid for both of them. He failed. He died at 9 o'clock on the morning of January 9, 1923, at Pentonville Prison, composed and insisting on her innocence. He was 20 years old. Whatever the nature of what existed between Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters, and there are those who argue that she romanticized him, that he was more infatuated than she was, that the age gap matters more than it appears, there is something in his conduct after the verdict that is, simply, extraordinary. A young man, facing his own death, spending his final weeks fighting for someone else. Whether that is love, or loyalty, or guilt, or all three, it is not the conduct of someone who was led astray by a manipulative older woman. It is the conduct of someone who believed in his own culpability and another person's innocence, and held on to that belief when holding on to it could not save either of them. Edith Thompson was buried in an unmarked grave within the walls of Holloway Prison, as was customary for executed prisoners. The grave had no marker. No name. No date. Nothing. In 1971, Holloway Prison underwent extensive rebuilding. The bodies of all the executed women buried within its walls were exhumed for reburial outside the prison, at the City of London Cemetery in East London. All of them. With one exception. Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Britain, executed in 1955, was not reburied with the others. She had family who wanted to receive her remains. Her body was claimed and reburied elsewhere. Edith Thompson was reburied in the City of London Cemetery. For decades, the grave had no marker. In 2018, 95 years after her execution, a memorial stone was placed on the grave. A memorial to Edith Thompson and to all the women executed at Holloway Prison. It reads, "In loving memory of Edith Thompson and all the women executed at Holloway Prison, may they rest in peace." She had been in an unmarked grave for 95 years. The Thompson-Bywaters case became, in the decades after the execution, one of the primary examples cited in arguments for the abolition of the death penalty in Britain. Capital punishment in England was suspended in 1965 and abolished permanently in 1969. The Thompson case, along with the hanging of Timothy Evans, who was executed for murders committed by the serial killer John Christie, and the hanging of Derek Bentley for a murder committed by his younger accomplice, was cited repeatedly in parliamentary debates as evidence that the death penalty produced irreversible injustices. The particular injustice in Edith Thompson's case was not that she was unquestionably innocent. It was that the evidence against her, subjected to any serious critical examination, was insufficient to justify her execution. The man who committed the murder denied her involvement. The physical evidence contradicted the letters. The moral case against her, the adultery, the passionate correspondence, the transgression of her domestic role, was not a legal case at all. She was hanged, in the most precise possible sense, for the kind of woman she was. Not for a crime she committed. The abolition of capital punishment removed the mechanism that made her execution possible. It did not undo it. In January 2023, 100 years after the execution, the case of Edith Thompson was back in the news. After decades of academics and campaigners arguing that she was the victim of sexism and a miscarriage of justice, the Ministry of Justice announced it would look again at her case, reversing a decision it had taken only the previous year to decline a review. The centenary of the execution had refocused attention on what had been done, and the political will to at least examine it had, finally, arrived. What the review might produce, whether a posthumous pardon, a formal acknowledgement of the injustice, or simply a report that concludes the conviction was legally sound, remained to be determined. The conviction still stood when this episode was produced. As of 2025, no posthumous pardon had been issued. Edith Thompson has been dead for over 100 years. Frederick Bywaters has been dead for over 100 years. Percy Thompson has been dead for over 100 years. The executioner who hanged her has been dead for over 90 years. The letters still exist. They were preserved as evidence and have since been studied by historians, literary scholars, and legal academics. Read in full, not in the selective prosecution excerpts that the jury heard, but complete, in sequence, with the literary and emotional context that Edith brought to every word she wrote. They are the letters of a woman of exceptional feeling and intelligence who was trapped in a life that could not contain her. They are not, reading them that way, a murder confession. They are something more complicated than that. They are the record of a woman trying to live more fully than her world permitted, through love, through writing, through the only form of freedom available to her. And they are the evidence used to hang her. Edith Thompson was born on Christmas Day, 1893. She died on January 9, 1923. She was 29 years old. She had lived in Ilford, worked as a chief buyer in the City of London, read novels and gone to the theatre and written 62 letters to a man she loved, who kept every letter. She had married a man who bored and sometimes hurt her. She had not, as the physical evidence established, successfully harmed that man at any point before he was killed by someone else. She screamed, "No, don't," in a dark street when the attack happened. Those two words are, perhaps, the most honest record we have of what she felt in the moment. No guilt. No calculation. Not the reaction of someone who had planned what she was watching. Shock and horror and a desperate attempt to stop it. Her own lawyer said she was hung for immorality. The physical evidence contradicted the prosecution's case. The man who committed the murder died insisting she was innocent. She was carried unconscious to the gallows and hanged while 4 people held her upright. The executioner who did it spent 9 years drinking and then cut his own throat with a razor. The petition signed by 1 million people went unanswered. The Ministry of Justice, 100 years later, said it would look again. And still, as of the writing of this script, the conviction stands. Mrs. Thompson was hanged for immorality. It is the most damning sentence in the entire history of this case. Not because it is surprising. Because it is accurate. She was 29 years old. She was born on Christmas Day. She wrote beautiful, passionate, terrible letters. She should not have died for them. Subscribe to Enter the Crime and tell us in the comments, do you believe Edith Thompson was guilty? And does it matter if the evidence wasn't sufficient to justify execution?